In my 5 minutes, I'm going to start off with the question, where does behaviour fit in? And I want to start off with a very big statement that I think that all of the challenges facing our society today is absolutely dependent on understanding human behaviour and solving the problems, changing human behaviour. I'm just going to say a little bit about health and a little bit about environment. So if we take health, nearly all of the kind of ill health that we try to avoid depends on us changing our behaviour. And here I have pictures of the big four. The 4 behaviours that account for 50% of the avoidable deaths. So we have smoking, excessive alcohol consumption, sedentary lifestyles, and unhealthy eating. There are many more than that, but those 4 together account for a lot of the avoidable morbidity and mortality. So that's just preventing getting ill to begin with. But then there's the whole area of managing ill health, managing chronic conditions, managing disability. As we're living longer, we're spending much more of our lives managing a variety of different chronic conditions. I've mentioned up here diabetes, pain, even something like medication adherence. Something like 30% on average of medication is not taken in the way that it should be for maximum effect. Think of all that waste of investment in the drugs to begin with, and then the waste in terms of potential benefits for people. So this is a whole area in which understanding behaviour and supporting people to change their behaviour can make a huge difference. And then finally, there's the health service itself. There's health professional behaviour. Having good quality healthcare absolutely depends on what health professionals do. The more that they draw on evidence-based scientific findings, the better quality the healthcare. Sadly, we know that many health professionals don't follow the evidence-based guidelines that they should. So that's a whole area of work and an area of work that I've also been involved with. So that just, I hope, showing you a bit about the domains even of health. Then the environment, I just want to give 2 examples from my work. One is being part of a large multidisciplinary project aimed at reducing plastic waste. And I don't have to tell this audience about the problems of plastic in the oceans. I should say that all of my work is multidisciplinary, working with lab scientists, working with policymakers, and in this case, we're really looking at the circular economy, how to reduce the production and the consumption of plastic, and also increase reuse, recycling. A second project is reducing carbon emissions. This project is a very ambitious one where, again, working with engineers, working with environmental epidemiologists, working with systems dynamics scientists. We're trying to support cities to bring about citywide transformations of a big scale to reduce carbon emissions. And we're working with 2 cities in China, 2 in Africa, and 2 in Europe. I want to now go on to give you probably the simplest way of thinking about behaviour as the basis for understanding how to move on from understanding behaviour to changing behaviour. So the simplest way of thinking about it is that behaviour depends on an interaction between 3 necessary conditions. And maybe you could try and think, a thought experiment in your heads, about what those conditions might be. And take any behaviour, but for the sake of argument, I'll take cycling. Cycling's good for our health, good for the environment. Now, in order to cycle, to get more people, more of us cycling, we need to make sure that we've got the capability. We know how to ride a bike. We know that cycling is good for our health and the environment. We can have those skills, but the cycling's not going to happen unless we also have, we're coming to that, motivation. You know, so one needs to want to do it, otherwise it's not going to happen. One can have all the capability in the world, one can have all the motivation in the world. It still won't happen unless we have the opportunity, which, yes, you need a bicycle, you need the resources to acquire the bicycle, and you actually need some safe places to cycle. So if we really want to change behaviour, and this applies to everything, always just try and think about what's the capability that's needed, what's the motivation, what's the opportunity, and what needs to shift for this particular behaviour, for this population and this context. I'll get just a little bit more complicated here. So capability is the psychological, the knowledge and skills, but also the physical ability. Motivation, and we'll hear more about this later, is both this is jargon, but the reflective mechanisms, which are our sort of top-down bit of our brain, our conscious decision-making, weighing up pros and cons, rational, what we think influences our behaviour. The reality is that a lot of our behaviour is influenced by the more automatic mechanisms, our drives, our emotions, our habits. And with opportunity, there's the physical opportunity, but also, really importantly, the social environment around us. We're very social animals, very influenced by our social environment. Now, think about this as a diagnostic tool. If you have a health problem and you want a solution to it, you go to see your GP, you expect your GP to do a good interview, observation, come up with a formulation, a diagnosis, before you get prescribed a course of action, which might include medication or something else. Similarly with behaviour, one absolutely needs to start with a good behavioural diagnosis. What's going on here? What needs to change? Before one comes up with a strategy that's likely to be effective for that particular behaviour in that particular context. And too often people think, I know about behaviour, I behave, I see other people behaving, I've got my ideas, jump into solutions without doing this sort of careful assessment work. So I'm going to now show you a framework where you can move from this way of understanding behaviour to what are the broad strategies that are likely to be effective for any given behaviour in its context. And this framework is called the Behaviour Change Wheel, and it was developed as a result of a synthesis, a bringing together of 19 different frameworks of behaviour change that we identified in the literature. And they were all a bit partial, there was a lot of overlap, so we thought, let's bring them all together. Now, I shall show you it. I don't expect you to take it all on board in this lightning talk, but here it is. In the middle is the green hub, and you see there we've got capability, opportunity, and motivation. So that's a starting point. Depending on which of those 6 segments your assessment thinks this needs to change behaviour, will point to one or more of these 9 possible intervention strategies. And then the grey outside ring are policies. So for long-term sustainability and thinking about the most effective behaviour change interventions are those that happen at many different levels and are sustained over time, we do need governments, organisations, institutions to be supporting behaviour change with appropriate policies, in addition to more specific interventions that are aimed at individuals or groups or communities. If anybody wants to see more about this, here's the website of the Centre for Behaviour Change, but a health warning, the website is currently being upgraded, so doesn't look in good shape at the moment, but in the future you can find out more from there. And I want to finish with a couple of the challenges that I think we face in terms of making our interventions more effective. We've got a long way to go. I think we've got a lot of potential now, and the first challenge actually comes out of the potential that we've really only begun getting in the last few years, which is the ability to measure behaviour. All of my career, or most of my career, we've had to gather data about behaviour in terms of often what people say about what they do through surveys and questionnaires. This is really inaccurate because people often forget, people often have various kinds of biases, and so, or they just don't pay attention to actually what was going on. But now we can measure directly. We have wearables such as this. Mobile phones have a lot of information about where you are, voices, the tone of your voice, how much light, the type of weather, etc. And then we can also put sensors into the environment. So we can see what's happening in relation to the environment, that people are moving about in real time. So we're not just taking snapshots of behavior a few months apart. We can take ongoing streams of data about behavior. However, the challenge that this produces is we have huge amounts of data, streams of data from many different sources. We can also get data about our physiological and internal functionings. And how do we put all of this together in order to really understand what's going on in a way that we can bring about change? So on the one hand, there's fantastic potential. I wish I was starting my career now because I think it's a really exciting time, but this is one of the challenges we face. The other, I think, is about involving behaviour science beyond the individual. So quite often people think about behavioural science as just about individuals. But what we're trying to do is think about individuals in relation to each other, in relation to the environment. And much of my work is really looking at bigger scale, application of behavioural science to bigger scale problems. So I mentioned earlier this particular project, Complex Urban Systems for Sustainability and Health. Well, where does behavioural science come in? We're working with communities, so understanding how to get people together to elicit the kind of problems and the solutions, bring that together, think about levers for change, help develop policies that are likely to be implementable and actionable, and then also think about, right, we can have really good policies about what should be changed in terms of making this city a healthier place with less carbon emissions. But putting policies into practice, it's rather like Tarula mentioned about putting our New Year's resolutions into practice. Governments are littered with good policies that aren't put into practice. Behavioural scientists can work out who needs to do what, when, where, how, in order to make this policy actually happen. And this depends on big, complex systems of how behaviours of key players interact. And by mapping this big system out, one can then begin to think about what's the entry point into the system, what's the best entry point to change that system around. So I really want to leave you with the idea that behavioural science, yes, it's about individuals, but that can be scaled up so one can think about changing cities as well as individuals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Next.
So good evening, everyone. Susan and I didn't actually coordinate our talks, but you might think so, as you'll see in a minute. So I want to start with a bit of basic science, and this is a field actually where connecting basic science of psychology with applications is actually really worthwhile. In bits of science we understand well that's not very necessary. So if you're trying to get a spaceship to the moon, you don't have to rethink the foundations of Newtonian or Einstein's contribution to physics. That you can take for granted and you can simply figure out how to apply it. But that's because we really understand, or somebody, not me, understands how that works really well. But in psychology, we don't understand anything very well. So the basic science is not something you can take as read. You have to figure out what bits of basic science are relevant to your problem and try to understand them and try to think how they apply. So I think in this field, rather unusually, there's a lot of sense in having connections between the people doing the basic research and people doing quite applied pieces of work. And I think that also makes it a very exciting place to be. So two snippets of basic science. One, which you can see from the figure on the left, and it may just be too small to see very clearly, there should be patches A and B. Can we see those? Yes, there's A, there's B. And they are obviously, well, that's a dark patch there and that's a light patch there. Now, I wouldn't be showing you, of course, that if it were not the case that they were in fact the same, because I'm a psychologist and I never like to do anything too obvious, and we all tend to play these tricks. But it's a weird trick, isn't it? I mean, how can it be that those two patches, A and B, can actually be the same brightness? They're exactly the same amount of light is entering your eye when you look at either of them. Now, the odd thing is that that's illustrating something that's extremely general, and although it's a very basic fact about perception, it applies just across all sorts of interesting applied problems. So the simplest way to explain what's happening there is that in the case of patch A, it's a dark thing. It looks dark because surrounding it are light things. So it's comparative. It looks dark compared to the things around it. On the other hand, B, which is actually precisely the same, it looks light because it's light compared to the things around it. So even though you ought to be able to see these two things which are right next to each other, or almost right next to each other, as the same, you can't because you're forced to compare with the very closest neighbors. And that's something that's very interesting when you think about anything else you care about. Because if you think, for example, what would happen to a population if everybody got richer, you might think, oh, maybe we won't feel any richer, because whether we judge ourselves to be rich or poor, or happy or sad, or happy with our houses or our cars or our families or anything else, may depend a lot on comparison to how things used to be, how things are for other people. So if everything gets better or everything gets worse, maybe we just don't notice. And indeed, as you'll know, I'm sure many of you, happiness surveys show exactly that. So we've had long, long periods of increasing wealth and welfare in many dimensions in the UK and across many parts of the world, but overall life satisfaction, absolutely the same. Now that might be because we aren't actually getting any happier, or it might be that this is an artifact of the way we're reporting our happiness, but either way, this kind of phenomenon has got something very profound to do with that. And in a world in which you're trying to make people happier and live better lives, then this is an important thing to worry about. Is economic growth in fact pointless? Or is it in fact a very good idea, but we're just not picking it up because our surveys are somehow victim to this fallacy? We'll leave that as an open question. The other thing I want to tell you in terms of very quick snippets, much more briefly, is that on the right we have a little diagram of the idea of virtual bargaining, which is something I work a lot on these days. So virtual bargaining is the idea that when we interact socially, we don't just talk and explicitly say, I'll do this, you do that, I think this, you think that. We also do a lot of that same kind of thing implicitly. So I'm working out, in this situation, I think you're thinking that, you're telling me this, you think I should open the door and you should walk through it, and I'll go to the left, you go to the right, I'll pull and you'll push. And most of the time, we can get along very successfully with each other and collaborate very effectively, where we actually have to articulate very little. The real magic of communication is how little we have to do. Most of our communication is, in fact, as it were, silent. We're doing it all virtually. And I think this is a very important concept, because if you want to understand when people work together well or when they work together badly, they work together well when they're virtual bargains. The things that are left unsaid are the same for all of us. If we all think, yes, if we had to spell out what the point of this activity is or why we're doing it or what our assumptions are, we'd spell it out in the same way, things are going to go well. If we all have dissonant assumptions hidden in the backs of our minds, then things are going to go badly. And I think that's, again, very important from the point of view of social cohesion, trying to solve any kind of complex social problem. We have to figure out what our hidden assumptions are and ideally ensure that they're as aligned as possible. Let's briefly focus on some action, not basic science now. This is nothing to do with me, this first one. Plastic bag taxes. This is something that we've all experienced in England fairly recently, and Wales and Scotland. This is actually data from Ireland, and you can see the astonishing effect of a fairly small plastic bag tax, going from a rate of plastic bag use there, and I think that's about 2001, so 2001, and it crashes, goes up a bit, then the taxes increase, it goes down, and it sort of goes along the bottom forevermore. And the same thing has been observed, not quite as drastically, for other countries in which plastic bag taxes have been introduced. And that's an astonishing thing, because the plastic bag cost is really low. So an economist would never imagine that people would think, oh, these plastic bags are so expensive, I'm not having them. What the tax is doing is it's sending a signal. In fact, it's sharing something we all feel, which is using plastic bags is bad, the shop's kind of telling me it's bad, or rather the government's telling me it's bad, and I know it's bad. And that little prompt, that little prod, makes one less likely to take a plastic bag and to feel bad if you do. And sure enough, after a while, those habits start to shift and plastic bags get eliminated. And no one's any the worse off. There are important shifts we have to make, which are bigger and harder than that. One is switching to heat pumps. away from gas. That's a big challenge for the UK. Another one is shifting our diets away from meat, not necessarily completely, but pushing towards a more plant-based diet from an environmental point of view. That's very important, probably also good from many aspects of health. And the other is pushing ourselves towards electric cars. Now, that's something that's happening, but is it happening fast enough? These are all things that are important behavioral changes that individuals have to make, and we need to find ways of encouraging them to do them quickly. Let's put that in the context of a wider problem, as one that Susan was talking about earlier, the challenge of environmental need for behaviour change in the context of the environment. The Climate Change Committee, of which I'm a member, which is the UK body that advises government on carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions generally, has recently, to our great delight and some astonishment, put out a report on with the objective that the UK reduces greenhouse gases to 0 by 2050. Sooner would be good, but by 2050 is at the outside. And that has been taken up and legislated in the last few weeks. So that's really an important step to commit to that, but how do you do it? It's going to require enormous amounts of changes of individual behaviour, such as I mentioned before. It's also going to require, again, as Susan mentioned, collective changes. Let me just give you 2 brief hints about how we might go about this and why it's tricky. The first thing is that if I want to reduce my carbon emissions as an individual consumer, the trouble is it's very much like trying to reduce the cost of my shopping with no prices on the goods. So I wander around the supermarket, I buy things, and someone says, you're just spending too much, you're spending too much. You must reduce your spending. And if I were to respond, yes, but there's no prices on anything, there's no till. I just walk into the supermarket and buy things, and nothing happens, and then you're telling me it's too expensive. How am I supposed to know? That is exactly the position we're in with respect to consumption with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, because we don't know, except in the most vague way, what the impacts of our individual behaviours are. So we need to do something about that. One way you might do that is to have shadow prices on every good, which don't express the cost of the good in money, they express an analogous cost in terms of environmental impact. You might think about various ways to do that. But unless we have something like that, we're just not going to know. So with the best will in the world, we will fail as individuals. But actually, individuals are only part of the problem, part of the solution. We also have to reorganize our society very fundamentally. And clearly, government's a very big part of that. So having targets and actually putting forward legislation to implement those targets is really important to convince other parts of government, industry, individuals that change is coming. For example, if we're going to move to electric vehicles, I'm not going to be the only person with my electric vehicle and no charging infrastructure. In fact, everyone's going to be having electric vehicles in whatever it is, 10 or 15 or 20 years, depending on how aggressive we want to be. I think we should be pretty aggressive on those targets, precisely because it will help us organize our behavior effectively towards a common goal. It's easy to stress the importance of governments, it's easy to stress the importance of individuals. Between those are all those other mid-level organizations of companies and local authorities and groups of people in all shapes and sizes. And understanding how they themselves can self-organize to achieve common goals is very important. And I think we're only going to make progress on really radical and fast progress on switching to lower greenhouse gas emissions if every part of our society from top to bottom starts to change its behavior. That is starting to happen. Lots of organizations are starting to think differently. Of course, thinking differently is one thing. Acting differently is a really crucial thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Toby?
Thank you. So when you think about it, most government activity ultimately has something to do with human behaviour, whether that's trying to increase educational attainment, reduce crime, reduce corruption, get us to recycle, buy electric cars, eat more healthily, etc. Often there's a behavioural essence at the centre of that. So we think it's important and useful that behavioural science is provided to policymakers, and that's essentially what the Behavioural Insights team was set up to do, to inject that expertise in behavioural science to the policymaking process. And there are various ways that can be done. You know, we can improve the way that conventional tools like regulation and taxation can be designed and implemented, or we can use more novel tools, things like nudging, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit about later. But I think where behavioural science is most interesting and novel in the policy world is where it draws upon some of the more recent findings as to the extent to which our behaviour is influenced by a number of factors, particularly social factors, which we've heard a bit about already, particularly contextual factors, which we've also heard a bit about, and sort of non-conscious drivers of behaviour. So just to exemplify what I mean by that, well, if you offer people a choice of coffee, small, medium, and large, across the population. Of course, you get a bit of a distribution of preferences there, but most people tend to gravitate towards the medium. And you ask them why, and they say, well, the small's a bit too small for me, the big's a bit too big for me, the medium's the right size. But if you do this, and you add a bigger option and take away the small option, and you ask them again, they go for the new medium, and you ask them why, and they say, well, the small's a bit too small for me, and the big's a bit too big for me, medium's the right size. So we're very good at sort of overlaying these retrospective, sort of somewhat rational explanations on our own behavior, but what's actually going on there is our choice is massively influenced by the context or the way in which that choice is presented. Therefore, of course, if you want to influence people's choices to some extent, you can manipulate the way they're presented. And this is classic marketing stuff. You go into a cinema, the reason they've got that extra large popcorn is not because they expect to sell very many of them, but because by having it means they're going to sell more of the large popcorns. So you can change the choice set. And the framing, the context really matters a great deal. Okay, so how do we use any of this stuff in the policymaking process? Well, I want to just briefly give you one example in a context of reducing excessive antibiotic prescriptions. So prescribing too many antibiotics in cases where they're not strictly necessary is a big social problem. It's, of course, contributing to antimicrobial resistance and the degrading effectiveness of antibiotics globally. So it's an important policy problem to try and reduce that excessive prescription rate. So in this instance, the sort of conventional approach might be to try and raise awareness amongst GPs, educate them to some extent, implore them to think more carefully about whether or not they need to prescribe. That's fine, but a behavioural insights approach would just be a bit more systematic in trying to understand what are the actual drivers, the actual opportunities from a sort of more nuanced, more sophisticated behavioural science perspective. And it's not always rocket science, but it's an important process to go through. So, for example, it's not necessarily GPs' knowledge or awareness of the problem. It's things more like they don't know they're high prescribers. They have no idea what's normal. They obviously consider themselves doing best, and that's often the case. So will they listen to government advice? Maybe, maybe not. There is often huge pressure from patients. Patients come in, they've got 5 minutes with the GP, they want to receive something, and a prescription is obviously something that they're happy with, so there's that sort of social interaction there. And of course, they're under limited time pressure. Like I said, they've only got a few minutes, and often it's the easiest solution just to give a prescription rather than to have a more lengthy conversation or take an alternative course of action. So what might we do to overcome those issues? Well, in this particular project of ours, we were sending out communications. This was with Public Health England, 2 GPs. We tried to address each of those issues. So firstly, we tried to identify the most credible messenger. So in this case, it was England's Chief Medical Officer, someone that GPs would very much respect. We tried to address that issue of patient pressure. So there was something that a GP could give to that patient, even without giving them a prescription. So they could give them self-care leaflets, but they could also give delayed prescriptions. So prescriptions that couldn't be cashed in for a few days, and then often, of course, the patient would realize they don't need it. We removed that sort of inconvenience hassle factor by just giving 3 quite clear, easy steps that GPs could follow as an alternative to prescribing antibiotics. And finally, we used this idea of sort of social influence or a sort of peer influence. So we put a message in that letter saying the great majority, 80% of practices in your area, that was tailored to the recipient, prescribe fewer antibiotics per head than yours. And the reason we tailored it to their area was because, of course, one counter-argument is, well, in my area, I've got lots of old patients, I need to prescribe more, and so on. So this was targeted specifically at the 20% highest prescribing GPs. We then tested this in a randomized controlled trial. So we had about 1,500 GP practices. A random half of them received this letter, a random half didn't, and then we look at the difference in prescription rates over the subsequent 6 months. What we find is that you may laugh, hold on 1 minute. Those practices that received the letter prescribed 3.5% less antibiotics than those that did not receive the letter. Now, 3.5% doesn't sound like a lot. That is statistically significant for anyone that's interested in that kind of detail. And actually, in the context, this is quite meaningful. So at the time, the NHS had put up a fund of around £4 million to try and reduce prescription rates by 1%, and then subsequently put up £150 million to reduce by 4%. This intervention cost £20,000, and we've got a 3.5% reduction. That's pretty significant in this particular context. Also, there was another campaign going on in parallel in a different set of practices using more conventional techniques, posters in the waiting rooms, etc., that kind of general awareness-raising effort, and that was also evaluated and had no impact whatsoever. So this is a classic nudge because it's not a silver bullet, it's not saving the world in one hit, but it's very cost-effective, it changes behaviour on the margins, and is actually very worthwhile. Okay, I think I've just got probably less than a minute left, and I want to give you 8 more examples, so hold on to your seats. Just a sort of flavour of the kind of things that we can do. By the way, these are not all ours. This is the collection of studies. Some of them are ours, some of them not. So we can use defaults. If you haven't changed your energy tariff in the last couple of years, you're probably on the default tariff, which, by the way, is probably the most expensive tariff. If we default people into the green electricity tariff, that can increase the numbers on those tariffs by 10 times. Way more effective than any kind of messaging campaign to implore people to proactively shift themselves. If you want to reduce food waste, one of the most impactful ways of doing that is simply to remove the tray from canteens. It's just a little bit more difficult to overfill your tray with stuff you're not going to eat. You still let people go back and get more if they want. You're not restricting their freedom of choice to eat what they want, but you're just adding a slight friction into overeating or overtaking of that food. If you want to get people to buy more energy-efficient washing machines and other appliances, indicating the price in terms of lifetime running cost rather than just having the upfront cost, can do that to some extent, because, of course, we tend to focus very much on the immediate cost, but we tend to discount consequences in the future. If you want to encourage cycling, we did a trial where we were trying to encourage uptake of a cycle share scheme in the USA. We found that people that had just moved home to the area where the cycle scheme was available were 4 times more likely to uptake this scheme than those that already lived next to this area where the cycle scheme was available. So this is the idea of timely moments. We're much more likely to change our behaviour when our habits and our routines are being disrupted anyway. If you want to encourage plant-based food, one tip is to not segregate it from the meat food. If you do segregate it, meat eaters tend to see it as a strong signal that it's not for them. It's sort of associations of otherness, and a quick and easy way of them whittling down the choices to them is to first rule out the things that are in the vegetarian section. So if you can integrate options, you're more likely to encourage people to consider them. Many behaviours are somewhat contagious. Solar panels, it would seem, fit that description. So people are more likely to install solar panels if they can see other people having installed solar panels in their area from their home. Along a similar vein, if you tell people that the majority of people in a hotel reuse their towel, that is a more effective way of getting people to do it than saying anything about the environment. And similarly, if you want to encourage people to use less energy, using a social comparison, so giving people bills that compare their energy use to that of their more efficient neighbours, has, across many studies, been shown to effectively, to a modest degree, but a very worthwhile degree, about 3–3.5% reduction in their energy consumption. So I'll leave it there. If anyone's interested in this stuff, I'm just going to leave that on screen, a few sort of very popular books that you may be interested in reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby.